I stood at the window, gazing out at the thick blanket of snow covering Anchorage. It had been years since I'd last visited, and while the city had changed, the cold felt just as biting. The trip was supposed to be a chance to reconnect with Joe, my husband, but instead, it was becoming a reminder of how far apart we had drifted. Joe had always been a difficult man, even more so in recent years. Since retiring, he had grown bitter, impatient, and more than anything, careless. His drinking had only gotten worse. I had come to Anchorage with the hope of rekindling some spark between us, but deep down, I feared it was already too late. The first sign of trouble came on our first night in town. We had planned to meet my son, Wilbert, and his wife, Martina, for dinner, but Joe had other ideas. As soon as we checked into the hotel, he was off, making excuses about needing to explore the local scene. In reality, I knew what he meant. He wanted to find a bar, and I had little energy to stop him. When I called him later that night, the sound of young women's laughter in the background was unmistakable. He was at a club. My heart sank. Why should I leave my drink and come back? He slurred into the phone when I asked him to return to the hotel. You're the one who lost the room key. I gripped the phone tighter, feeling my temper rise. Joe, I didn't lose the key. You took it with you. I can't get into the room and it's freezing outside. His response came quick and careless. Then go sleep in the car. I'm not leaving just because you're nagging me. The anger I had tried so hard to keep under control finally boiled over. Fine. If that's how you feel, I'll sleep outside. Goodbye. I hung up before he could say anything else and stormed out of the lobby. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just wanted to be anywhere but there, away from his cold indifference. The freezing air hit me hard as I stepped outside, and I realized almost immediately that I had made a mistake. I wasn't dressed for this weather, and Anchorage at night was unforgiving. My breath came out in quick puffs of steam as I stood there, trying to figure out what to do next. Should I go back inside and ask for a spare key? Should I find a place to sit and wait until Joe came back? My pride wouldn't let me consider either option. Just then, my phone buzzed. It was Wilbert. Mom, where are you? His voice was full of concern. I hesitated, embarrassed by the situation I had found myself in. I can't get into the hotel room, I finally admitted. Joe has the key and he's busy. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Wilbert responded. Stay where you are. I'm sending someone to pick you up. Relief flooded over me as I waited in the cold. Within minutes, a car pulled up, and I was driven to Wilbert's house. When I arrived, Martina was already waiting by the door, her arms crossed and her face a mixture of concern and anger. What happened? She asked as she ushered me inside. Her warm house was a stark contrast to the icy chill outside, and I felt a pang of guilt for barging in like this. I explained everything to her as we sat in the living room, sipping hot tea. The more I spoke, the more furious Martina became. By the time I finished, she was shaking her head in disbelief. I can't believe he did that to you, she said, her voice hard. Joe's always been difficult, but this is too much. Wilbert, who had been sitting silently through my story, finally spoke up. We can't let him get away with this, Mom. I looked at him, confused. What do you mean? Wilbert's face was set in determination. It's time Joe learned what it feels like to be treated the way he treats you. We need to teach him a lesson. I shook my head, not quite understanding. How? What are you talking about? Martina leaned forward, her eyes glinting with a hint of mischief. Don't worry, Sophia. We've got a plan. Joe's going to learn what it's like to be left out in the cold. The suspense of her words hung in the air as I tried to piece together what they were planning. Wilbert stood up, a sense of urgency in his movements. We need to act fast. Joe's at the club right now, right? I nodded, unsure of where this was going. Yes, but... Then we'll go to him, Martina interrupted. But not as we are. We're going to make this memorable. Martina's words unsettled me. What did she mean by memorable? I had never seen her this serious before, and part of me wondered if this was a joke. But as Wilbert made a call to his club, giving instructions in a low voice, it became clear that this was no joke. An hour later, I found myself standing in front of a mirror in the back room of Wilbert's club, completely transformed. Martina had called in her personal stylist, and in no time I was dressed in a stunning black gown, my hair and makeup done to perfection. I looked like a different person, someone I hadn't been in years. "Are you ready?" Martina asked, standing behind me. I turned to her, feeling a mixture of nerves and excitement. "I guess so. But what exactly are we doing?" Martina smiled, a hint of mischief still in her eyes. "We're going to remind Joe of who you are and what he's taking for granted." Before I could ask for more details, Wilbert appeared at the door. "It's time. Let's go." As we made our way through the club's dimly lit hallways, I could feel the adrenaline building. What was waiting for me out there? How was Joe going to react when he saw me? The questions swirled in my mind, but I had no choice but to follow along. When we reached the main floor of the club, the music was loud, and the crowd was thick with people laughing and dancing. In the middle of it all, I spotted Joe, sitting at a table with a drink in his hand, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Martina was the first to approach him. She walked over, her heels clicking on the floor, and placed a hand on his shoulder. Joe, caught off guard, looked up at her with surprise. "Mind if I join you for a drink?" she asked, her voice smooth and confident. Joe, clearly taken by her appearance, grinned. "Of course," he said, patting the seat next to him. "I'd never turn down a drink with a beautiful woman." Martina shot me a glance as she sat down, a silent signal. It was my turn. I took a deep breath and walked toward their table, my heart pounding in my chest. Joe didn't notice me at first. He was too busy making small talk with Martina, completely oblivious to the storm that was brewing around him. But when I finally stood in front of him, Joe looked up and the smile froze on his face. "Sophia?" He blinked, confusion spreading across his features. "What are you doing here?" I crossed my arms, standing tall. "I'm here to remind you of something, Joe." He laughed nervously, glancing between me and Martina. "What are you talking about?" "You left me out in the cold tonight," I said, my voice steady. "You thought it was funny to ignore me, to treat me like I didn't matter. So now it's your turn to feel what that's like." Joe's face turned pale as the realization set in. Wait, I didn't mean..." But before he could finish his sentence, Wilbert appeared at his side, his expression serious. "You've taken my mother for granted for too long, Joe. It's time you understand what that feels like." Joe's eyes widened as Wilbert motioned to the club's staff. In a flash, 2 men were at Joe's side, lifting him from his chair and guiding him toward the exit. "Wait!" "What are you doing?" Joe stammered, his voice rising in panic. Martina stood up, her voice calm but firm. "We're not going to hurt you, Joe. We're just going to show you what it's like to be left out." The doors to the club swung open, and the cold night air rushed in. Joe's protest grew louder, but the staff didn't stop. They led him outside and left him there, shivering in the snow, just as he had left me. As I watched from the doorway, a strange sense of satisfaction washed over me. Joe was finally experiencing what it felt like to be abandoned, to be treated like he didn't matter. And though part of me felt guilty for going along with this plan, another part of me knew it was necessary. For too long, I had put up with Joe's behavior, excusing it, hoping things would get better. But nothing had changed, and I realized now that nothing ever would, unless he was forced to see the consequences of his actions. The night air bit into my skin as I stepped outside to face him. Joe looked up at me, his face filled with regret. "Sophia, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for things to get this bad." I stared at him, my emotions conflicted. "Do you really mean that, Joe? Or are you just saying it because you're cold and alone?" He hung his head, his breath coming out in shaky clouds of steam. "I'm saying it because it's true. I've been a terrible husband. I see that now." I took a deep breath, letting his words sink in. Could I trust him? Could I believe that this was more than just an apology born from desperation? Before I could answer, Wilbert and Martina joined me outside, standing silently by my side. The suspense of the moment hung in the air, thick and heavy, as we all waited for what would happen next. Joe's eyes flicked between the three of us, his expression pleading. "Please, give me another chance. I'll change. I'll be better." I glanced at Wilbert, who gave me a small nod. Martina, too, looked at me with understanding in her eyes. This was my decision. I stepped forward, standing over Joe. "You've hurt me, Joe. You've made me feel small, insignificant, and it's going to take a long time for me to forgive that." Joe swallowed hard, his eyes glistening with what I could only hope were genuine tears. "I know, Sophia. I know." The silence stretched on as I weighed my options. Part of me wanted to walk away, to leave Joe in the cold just